This is a game that I played in the tournament about 7 years ago. I was playing with the black pieces, and in the opening I faced a bit of a surprise and moved something that I had never seen. But because of this tournament I was in a good shape, even though I got a somewhat difficult and complicated position. Just being able to solve tactical problems and to create problems for my opponent kind of helped me through the game. So the opening is the Spanish opening, and at the time I used to play the open variation with knight first coming out to f6, and then after castle, black opens up the game by taking on e4. He gains the pawn for the moment, but white has easy ways of getting the pawn back. So this is the main line of the open variation. Black has some structural drawbacks in his position, but the pieces are pretty active, and he hopes to utilize the active placement of pieces to compensate for the pawn weaknesses. This is also the main line. And here I used to play a pretty sharp and somewhat crazy line where black gives up the two pieces for a rook and a pawn, but gets some initiative and opens some files against the white king. So I take on f2, open up the f file, first take on f2 with a check, and then recapture on f6. I think here the main line is knight to f1 or king g1, but my opponent surprised me by playing pawn to a4, which kind of doesn't deal with the king being here, doesn't deal with developing these pieces, but it pursues a good idea of trying to open up the a file and maybe trade off the rooks. So I was kind of surprised by this move, and I'm pretty sure my opponent prepared this line just for our game. And here the right move was probably to play something like b4, because then the a file remains shut down, black's putting pressure on c3, and if white takes, then the knight has a good outpost on b4, so this was the right way to play it probably. I decided to just go for avoiding the exchange of rooks, and I moved my rook away from the a file. And in this variation, black often plays this move just to exert more pressure on the e file. So this move also makes some sense. But now, after the exchange and a couple more typical moves, white gets to activate the rook, and now he's putting pressure on the 6th rank, and now my knight is pinned. And that rook that usually does nothing in this line is suddenly active. So I played this move queen to d6 just to kind of consolidate a little bit, to guard this pawn for one thing. White well, opens up the bishop, maybe plans to play this move and attack this pinned knight, and he also opens up the queen, so now there's more pressure on d5. I decided to kick the rook with bishop to c8. The rook moves, and now if the bishop moves anywhere, white is going to exchange a pair of rooks, which is probably in his interest. I play knight to e5 to put pressure on this knight, and white starts to attack my pawn weaknesses. I could have played something like pawn to, well, I could have exchanged here and then play pawn to c6 just to guard everything. But this seemed a little bit passive, so I decided to complicate the game a little bit, and I played c5. So the idea is that the rook is a little bit loose, there's a bit of a pressure here, white hasn't fully developed yet, and there are some active rooks that I have. And the idea is that this knight is guarding on f3, and if it moves then I get to take on f3 and spoil white's pawn structure. So he first decided to exchange on e5, and here I could take on e5, but my idea was to complicate things a little bit more, and as an intermediate move I captured on d4, and this move has a trap, and we'll see what the trap is. He captured back, and here I play kind of the continuation of my tricky line, and I was lucky because white didn't figure out the complications and very soon played the wrong move. So I could just play bishop to g4, and that would hit the rook and the queen, and it would cause one set of complications. Instead I decided to cause a different set of complications, and I played rook takes e5, and the idea is very nice, but it shouldn't have worked. Here white should have taken, and he must have gotten scared of my idea, which is queen to c5, king has to go, and now very nicely I can take on c2, and it turns out that, well, he can't take because then I'm going to give checkmate. And otherwise it seemed to both of us that after this I can just move the king back, and it seems like I'm threatening all kinds of back rank checkmates. With the rook in particular, I'm threatening to take the bishop, and also the bishop is under attack, so there's no time to make an escape square, say like this. And I'm just going to take the bishop. So what we both have missed here is that white had a nice defensive move, bishop to e3, and I would have to struggle here. I would have to struggle to make a draw here, because I'm down a pawn. White has this strong pawn. The position is complicated. There are opposite colored bishops on the board, but I would have to struggle. The idea is that, say if I give a check, then the bishop can go back to g1, and now it's my bishop here that's in the same boat. It's interesting how both back ranks are so weak, and both players are struggling to protect their back rank. But this would have been to white's advantage, so I would probably have to suck it up here and just after bishop e3 take on b2, and white has another good move, and here I would be down a pawn, and it's a bit hard to say if this is winning or lost, but I would have to struggle. Instead, my opponent has played he got scared of taking on e5, and he played bishop to f4, and I ended up playing queen to c6, and now it turns out even though my rook is hanging, so is his rook on a8, and he had to take on e5, and then I took on a8, and I have an extra exchange here, and the game went down pretty quickly from here. Converting the exchange didn't turn out to be too difficult. White could have traded on h6, but then the endgame is actually good for black because he's still up in exchange, and the rook is here much stronger than the bishop, and after a few more moves it turned out that white is gonna get mated here, because if he plays g3 that weakens the second rank, and if he goes to h1 it's also mate. So it's a very complicated game, and even though the opening didn't go well for me because I was able to come up with interesting tactics, in complications my opponent didn't figure out all the details and lost.